If it wasn't for Matilda, we'd all be speaking German now. Forget the Sherman, forget about the Panther, forget the T-34.
This was the only Allied tank in frontline service from 1939 that was still there in 1945, and it did so in every theatre of World War II, with distinction.
But most importantly, on a single day in 1940, it was instrumental in changing the course of history.
This is the A-12 Matilda II, a tank that's gone underappreciated for far too long. Matilda's wartime story begins in the early days of World War II in northern France with the British Expeditionary Force. May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg is bulldozing through French and British lines, with the Allies on the brink of collapse. This is where the Matilda II gets its first taste of action, and the coming battle would have significant impact on the course of the war and the way the German army would go on to fight it.
On the 21st of May, near Arras, 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments are pressed into a desperate spoiling attack to slow the advance.
There are only a handful of Matilda IIs available to the Royal Tank Regiment, 16 of them, along with 58 of the smaller and less well-armed Matilda Is. But it would prove to be just enough. Taking the enemy by surprise, they smashed into the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, causing panic and chaos. Transport was destroyed, infantry was scattered, and SS Totenkopf troops actually ran away. The action sent shockwaves through the German High Command, who issued the Haltbefehl and stopped the entire German advance there and then.
The Matildas had stopped Blitzkrieg in its tracks. Had the German advance continued, British and French troops awaiting evacuation on the beaches of Dunkirk would have been overrun and destroyed.
They'd bought precious time, preventing defeat and allowing British and French troops to escape, and crucially, to fight another day.
And that's why you could say, twisting a well-known phrase, if it wasn't for Matilda, we'd all be speaking German now.
Not many tanks can claim to have had such a singular impact on the war, but this success was short-lived, with 7th Panzer reeling. Rommel, the divisional commander, pulled together a scratched gun line of artillery and flak, hitting the British armour at close range. The Matildas had met their match, and the losses began to rack up as the slow-moving tanks were picked off. By now, the tanks had outrun their infantry support, had no air cover, and were under murderous artillery fire.
After this action, just 2 Matilda IIs and 25 Matilda Is remained operational, and they would be abandoned in the evacuations that followed.
So interestingly, not only did Rommel's intervention rather spoil the party, the whole experience would have a pretty significant impact on German thinking. It was concern about the Matilda II and the French Char B that reinforced the use of the 88mm in the anti-tank role, and also for Hitler's demand to have a tank that could carry the 88mm sooner rather than later.
That's how we end up with Tiger, but that is another story. Instead, let's see how we end up with Matilda II and what made it so effective. In 1940, the Matilda II had 2 key strengths and 2 key weaknesses. We'll deal with those in a moment. But as the name suggests, there were 2 Matildas, and the Matilda Mark I really wasn't up to much. And this is it, the A11 Matilda I. It's a visual illustration of the problems Britain was facing in the 1930s.
Firstly, an emerging threat from an increasingly punchy Nazi Germany means that the country needs to rearm. But, thanks to the Great Depression and debts from the previous war, the government is skint. On top of this, there's immense competition from the Navy and the Air Force for the limited cash there is. Then there was the British tank doctrine of the day. It basically says you need slow, tough infantry tanks to support the infantry, and faster cruiser tanks to do the job of cavalry. So the tank budget was further split.
This is what you get when economy is the main consideration. It's the wish.com of infantry tanks. 140 were built, the maximum cost of £5,000 each. Now the hull is just about big enough for the engine, the gearbox and 2 crew. The tracks, as you can see, are completely exposed. It's not fast, 8 miles an hour, but it doesn't need to be. this is an infantry support tank. What it did need was good armour protection. It certainly got that. 60mm on the sides, 65mm round the front on the glacis. That's a huge amount for the period. I mean, think about the early Panzer IIIs. They started off with 15mm, beefed up to 30mm later on.
We've covered Matilda I in detail before, but you can't help looking at this tank and not thinking there's something really important missing. The .303-inch Vickers machine gun in the turret was a decent weapon, but it wouldn't be able to deal with enemy fortifications like pillboxes or armoured strongpoints, or tanks for that matter.
For that reason, it didn't impress the top brass. So even before it had entered service, a specification was issued for a bigger and better infantry tank in September 1936.
This was the result, the A12 Matilda II. But what about those strengths and weaknesses?
Its strengths are in the thickness of the armour, and the frontal armour here is 75mm, and the fact it had a very effective gun. Now, don't be fooled by the size. This 2-pounder was the best tank gun in the world at the time. Matilda II's two main weaknesses were firstly that as a tank it was very mechanically complicated, and secondly there were very few available, and this is down to problems with industrial capacity. Let's have a closer look.
The A12 shares its basic structure, the hull shape with its pointed nose, although cast rather than riveted construction, the suspension, and a lot of common components with the A11.
Where it changes is size. Got a wider and a longer hull, bigger turret to fit 3 of the 4 crew members, plus the 2-pounder gun, and the tracks are now enclosed, making them less vulnerable. The specification demanded that the tank should be able to cross an 8-foot wide trench or anti-tank ditch. It's also, as you can see, fitted with mud chutes. Now, they'd work well on the First World War Whippet, but they didn't suit all conditions, as we will see.
The Royal Ordnance QF 2-pounder was very good. It could outperform the German Pak 36 and the French 2.5cm, with the basic AP round able to penetrate 40mm of 30-degree sloped armour at 914 metres. That's 1,000 yards.
Now, this is a good armour-piercing round, certainly for the time, but the problem was it couldn't fire a worthwhile HE, and that made infantry support against entrenched positions very difficult.
That said, accuracy was good when firing on the move, although it was strangely less good when firing with the gun trained directly forwards, as the suspension tended to bounce, throwing off the aim. The 2-pounder was supported by a coaxial MG, initially a Vickers, but this would be replaced by a 7.92mm Bisa because it was less bulky. And interestingly, the original plan for a Hull MG had to be dropped because there simply wasn't room. So here in the turret you can see it is, even by World War II tank standards, very cramped for 3 crew. We've got the gunner over on the left-hand side, the loader the other side of the gun breech on the right, and then the commander with his cupola is rear and left. The tank does have a turret floor, unlike some, which revolves with the turret, and underneath the turret floor, you can't actually see this, there's a universal mount in the centre, and that supplies electricity to the turret when the turret is traversing. In the centre you see what the breech of the 2-pounder. It's a very neat little gun, it really is. I mean, compared to some hulking great things, it really is very, very neat, very precise. Down below that, ammunition stowage, you can see the semicircular bin. This one doesn't actually have the large turret floor box of later models. I don't know why that wasn't fitted. Round at the rear of the turret, there's the number 19 set. That replaced the larger and rather more bulky number 11 set, and does give you a little bit more elbow room, but frankly it's quite marginal. This is a very, very confined space for 3 guys to operate in. Driver's position up at the front of the tank. In the centre is the gear change lever, and then you've got the tillers to left and right, and the wooden boxes that you can see down on the floor, those are actually the whole batteries. They're in wooden boxes, as is common practice at the time, because obviously these are wet acid batteries and they cause corrosion and they also fume. Among the specifications for the A12 were that it was to be capable of 15 miles an hour. It's almost twice the speed of the A11. But at 25 tonnes, it was over twice the weight.
Finding an engine to power it was going to be something of a problem. And this brings us to the major problems with Matilda II, which relate to the industrial capacity and production problems the military was experiencing at the time.
The usual go-to for tank design was the successful manufacturer Vickers, who designed and built the A11, to a design by the highly experienced Sir John Carden.
But with rearmament in full swing, Vickers were already operating at full capacity. And the other companies with tank building experience were already committed to other projects.
So, the contract for the A12 was awarded to the Vulcan Foundry, a failing locomotive engineering works who had very little experience of tank design and production. Among the numerous issues this raised were the lack of skilled and experienced draftsmen available to this smaller company, and their lack of clout in securing and sourcing the necessary components. This led to major compromises and delays, and meant the first prototypes weren't ready until April 1938, and the first 6 production A12s weren't delivered until the 31st of October 1939, over a month after the outbreak of war, and explaining why very few were in France the following spring. At a time when tanks were pretty much hand-assembled, the A12 proved a complex tank to build, and the final production run of 2,920 had to be split between 5 other factories, which interestingly included the Titanic shipbuilders Harland and Wolff. It was initially powered by twin bus engines, 2 6.7-litre AEC units. These were reliable commercial units, but doubling up on engines also doubled up on maintenance and the potential for breakdowns. The gearbox is a Wilson self-changing epicyclic design, efficient and well designed, operated by compressed air. That gives you 5 forward gears, 1 reverse, and an emergency low gear.
The triangular gap between the hull and the tracks has been infilled, and this is a tool locker. It also incorporated a secondary air intake for the engine, although apparently this pulled an awful lot of dust. That is really not what you would want in something like desert conditions. And after a brief but eventful trip to France, that is where Matilda would be deployed next.
September 1940. Mussolini invades Egypt in an attempt to seize the vital Suez Canal and triggers the Desert War.
It was here that the Matilda enjoyed its fighting heyday, massively outclassed the Italian armour it's facing, was able to inflict huge losses, and it played a very significant part in forcing the Italians back into Libya.
The 2-pounder gun could easily punch through the armour of something like the M1139 at standard battle ranges.
Conversely, the Italian 37mm tank gun was completely ineffective against Matilda, and even 10cm howitzer rounds fired point blank couldn't penetrate the armour.
Further south, in January 1941, B Squadron, 4 RTR, also engaged Italian tanks in Eritrea. In an instance cited by Brian Perrott, B Troop took on 17 Italian tanks, knocking out 13 and sending the remaining 4 into retreat. Demonstrating the effect of a 2-pounder round, an examination showed that the 2-pounder shot had passed through the front plate, driver, engine, and out through the rear plate. Such performances earned Matilda II the nickname Queen of the Desert, despite some mechanical frustrations associated with steering, the engine and the gearbox, which were perhaps more easily forgiven at this point in such a harsh environment.
But the good times couldn't last forever.
The German Africa Corps was dispatched to prop up the battered Italians in early 1942, and they brought with them new kit to balance the odds. The new 5cm Pak 38 could do what the earlier Pak 36 couldn't, and penetrate the Matilda's frontal armour. And of course the Matilda had already encountered the 8.8cm flak in France. But in the open desert, with long ranges and flat trajectory, this anti-aircraft gun could really come into its own.
In attacking gun positions, the Matilda was at a distinct disadvantage because it couldn't fire a decent high explosive round. And the Afrika Korps were expert in the use of dug-in anti-tank screens. On the 15th of June 1941, 16 Matildas of 4 RTR charged a German gun line at the Halfaya Pass in Libya. Only one came back.
In an attack on the Sidra Ridge in July 1942, 70 Matildas in 2 waves attacked an enemy gun line of 88 and 50mm guns. Only 12 survived. At the same time, Matilda was becoming less effective against German armour too. Panzer IIIs and IVs were getting thicker armour and more powerful guns themselves. But the Matilda was still highly rated by the Germans, who pressed several captured tanks into service themselves.
Its main advantage, heavy armour, was increasingly compromised. But the thing that finally did for Matilda was the fact that it wasn't possible to upgun it to carry the new 6-pounder. That would have needed a bigger turret, and the turret ring could not be enlarged.
Meanwhile, newer designs like the Valentine and Churchill could, and they were easier to build too.
Obsolescence beckoned, and attrition took its toll. By October 1942, there are very few serviceable Matilda IIs left in North Africa. But it wasn't done yet. Those that were left ended up being used as test beds for a range of experimental equipment, some of which would be used in the D-Day funnies of 79th Armoured Division.
Mine flails, mine rollers, the tank laying carpet, a fascine and a trench or gap crosser would all be employed on Churchill tanks later on.
This is the last surviving example of the Matilda CDL, Canal Defence Light, a weapon so secret that very few field commanders actually knew it existed. The idea was that CDLs would be used in numbers, each one shining a flickering 13 million candle power arc light to illuminate and dazzle the enemy.
But it was so secret it was never used, even though 11 RTR landed in Normandy with them in 1944 as part of 79th Armoured Division.
Elsewhere, the Matilda's frontline career continued. But before we head to the Eastern Front, if you're enjoying this video, please give us a like. It helps us beat the algorithm and it gets our videos to a wider audience. Also, if you want the last word on Matilda, get hold of a copy of this book, The Tank Museum Guide by Colonel Dick Taylor. It's fully comprehensive, it's available from our online shop, and it even covers the restoration of the tank behind me. Now, we're off to the Soviet Union.
About 40% of the Matilda IIs built, 1,185 tanks, were sent to bolster the Soviet war effort. The 900 or so that survived the dangerous convoy route were used extensively in 1942, doing a respectable job. But the Soviets too would see signs that, against the Germans at least, Matilda's best days were probably behind her. While they appreciated the armour, they found it too slow and undergunned when compared to the homegrown T-34. To counter this, they tried to upgun it with the Soviet 76mm ZIS-5 gun, but predictably this was far too big. However, they did like the 3-inch howitzer on the close support variant to fire HE, and made more use of the 2-pounder HE round than the British ever had.
The Matilda did not cope well with the cold, with snow and frozen mud clogging the suspension units of the running gear, and additionally the tracks were not good on ice. They needed studs welding on. However, Matilda had filled a serious gap in Soviet fighting capacity. By 1942, there were very few Matilda IIs left, but that didn't matter so much, because by that time, the Red Army had a lot more T-34s at its disposal. But there was still one theatre of war where Matilda II could continue to play to its strengths.
battles of the sort taking place on the Eastern Front weren't going to be taking place in the dense jungles of the Pacific Islands, where the Australians and US forces were fighting a tough campaign against the Japanese. As an infantry tank, the Matilda II was well suited to an environment where it could fulfil its primary role in infantry support.
By mid-1942, just over 200 Matilda II tanks had arrived in Australia, although just under half had to be cannibalised for spares to keep the rest running.
Being relatively small, but also very solid, Matilda was ideal for jungle bashing. It could smash its way through trees and brush that lighter tanks, like the Stuart, found very hard going. That said, the Australians made a few modifications to their Matildas to improve their jungle capability. These included armoured track idler guards to prevent damage as the tank smashed its way through dense timber, a collar to protect the turret ring from close-range fire, and an improved commander's cupola for better visibility.
Field modifications carried out by the crews themselves included using sand channels and wire mesh to screen off the engine louvers from grenades. Now, the dense jungle meant that Japanese infantry could get in really close, so that was a major danger.
The Australians also realised how valuable the howitzer-armed close support variant could be in this environment. As the 3-inch round was small, the tanks could carry a good quantity, and they were highly effective at knocking out enemy strongpoints. As a result, tactics were amended, and close support tanks would be used as troop leaders' vehicles, taking point during advances supported by 1 or 2 gun tanks. The Japanese, realising that their 37mm anti-tank gun wasn't a lot of use against the Matilda's armour, took to improvising high-yield anti-tank mines from heavy artillery rounds.
In tribute to the sheer toughness of Matilda, a tank of 2nd 9th Armoured Regiment, Tarakan, Borneo, was hurled 18 feet into the air when it hit one of these things. The crew survived with only minor injuries.
As in the desert, Matilda II offered flexibility for experimentation. The Frog flamethrower was ideally suited to jungle warfare and horrifyingly effective at clearing out complex enemy bunker positions. The Hedgehog, which could fire a volley of 65-pound mortars, was developed too late to see service. Close to 400 Matilda IIs would go into service for the Australians and go efficiently about their business for the remainder of the war.
With the surrender of Japan in 1945, Matilda II was 1 month shy of a full 6 years frontline service, something no other Allied tank of World War II achieved. So, was the Matilda II the best tank of the war? Well, that might be a bit of a stretch. In any case, what does best even really mean?
Matilda II was probably the best tank in 1939, but when we look at its entire contribution, it stopped Blitzkrieg and enabled the Dunkirk evacuation, allowing Britain to fight on. It trounced the Italian army. It bought time for the Soviets to bring their newer tanks into service, keeping them in the fight. It was a test bed for the important innovations that would be used by the 79th Armoured Division on D-Day and beyond, and it was an essential part of the Australian arsenal against the Japanese. It's the only tank that stays in frontline service, unaltered and more or less unmodified, from 1939 to 45.
No other tank made such a big contribution from the beginning right the way up to the end of World War II, and in just about every theatre of war. That's why we should, quite seriously, consider Matilda II as one of the most important tanks of the war. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below.